Tonight, you'll imagine a world without voices, a world where humans never add vocal cords. If you enjoy these calm, quiet explorations, don't forget to like and subscribe for more, and let me know in the comments. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? First, we will start with the biology of it, then evolution, culture, and much more. Now close your eyes, take a slow deep breath, and let's begin. In this world, human throats never learn to speak. No folds of muscle vibrate to form sound. Breath moves freely, unshaped and silent. Infants arrive without that first piercing wail that announces life in the world they know. Instead, they tremble in their parents' arms, eyes wide, tiny hands opening and closing in instinctive patterns that carry meaning even before true language exists. The larynx is smooth, small, no ridges or tension to produce voice. Evolution shaped it for breathing alone, conserving energy, and granting a quieter, calmer life. There is no swelling of cartilage to strengthen a cry, no need for muscles that squeeze air into pitch and volume. Their chests rise and fall evenly, no forceful gusts of speech disrupting the hush. Communities adapt to this quiet anatomy. Parents learn to soothe newborns with gentle gestures and subtle touches, tracing calming patterns across small backs. Families gather close, reading intent in motion rather than listening for sound. Conversations happen without interrupting the steady rhythm of breath, every inhale and exhale a promise of patience. As generations pass, bodies grow accustomed to this design. Throats remain unburdened. The very act of living is softer, marked by measured breathing. Without voices to dominate, social order relies on seeing and waiting. No one can shout another down. Conflicts can't escalate through raised tones. The quiet becomes the foundation of understanding. At dusk, families sit around fires that crackle softly, the only sound in the dark. They tell stories without a single spoken word, hands casting shadows that dance against cave walls. Breath warms the air but carries nothing but life itself. In that silence, there is room for everything else: trust, intention, shared memory. A kind of communication that begins not in sound but in the promise to observe. In this silent world, eyes became the first and most essential language. Evolution favoured those who could see more, notice more, read the smallest flicker of movement. Over countless generations, human eyes sharpened, growing larger and more expressive. A glance carried entire conversations, layered with questions, answers, emotions that words could never hold. Children learned early to study faces with solemn focus. They searched for meaning in every blink, every widening of pupils, every subtle narrowing that signalled doubt or warning. Watching was their first language, learned before hands could form signs. Parents taught with raised brows and softened gazes, scolding with nothing but a hard stare, forgiving with eyes that softened like dawn. Communities built their lives around these watching eyes. Strangers passed one another in open plazas, meeting each other's gaze with slow, respectful nods. There was no possibility of ignoring someone's words while pretending to listen. If you turned away, you ended the conversation entirely. Eye contact was trust itself, the promise to receive what was given. In darker places they adapted further. Pupils widened to gather every fragment of light. Fires were set low so faces stayed visible without harsh shadows. Hands flickered in the warm glow, but it was the eyes that made meaning real. They caught the tremble of fear, the shine of delight, the wetness of grief held bravely in the corners. Even travel required this careful seeing. Camps were arranged so no one sat hidden or out of sight. Watchers stayed vigilant at night, not listening for calls of alarm but scanning for gestures that warned of danger. Communication relied on the certainty of being seen, on the shared responsibility of observation. Eyes replaced the roar of voices. They prevented misunderstanding because nothing could be truly hidden. No false smile could fool when the eyes remained cold. No apology was real unless sorrow welled in them. In that honesty, society found a kind of peace, an unspoken promise to truly look and to truly be seen. Without voices, the human face became a canvas for language. Evolution favoured subtlety, layering muscles beneath skin to craft a silent vocabulary of expression. Tiny twitches told of suspicion, the briefest lift of a brow signalled surprise, and a softening at the corners of the mouth conveyed acceptance and care. Children learned this language from birth. Watching their parents with round, solemn eyes, they absorbed the unspoken grammar of furrows and dimples. A warning glare replaced a harsh word. A playful smirk teased where laughter had no sound. Families practiced in shared silence, shaping generations of faces more eloquent than any spoken phrase. Communities built entire customs around these expressions. Greetings were slow and deliberate, a combination of hand gestures and careful facial changes that conveyed nuance and respect. Agreements were sealed with steady, unbroken gazes, brows lifting just enough to show openness. Conflict simmered in narrow eyes, cooled by deliberate relaxation of tension, the face itself offering apology before hands even moved. Facial artistry evolved alongside this language. Decorative scars, pigments, jewellery placed to highlight expression rather than hide it, lines drawn to emphasize smiles, to deepen the shadows around eyes, to make every shift more readable in flickering firelight or under bright sun. The face was not just identity but message, an open letter that no one dared ignore. In gatherings, elders told entire histories with nothing but shifting expressions and graceful hands. The young watched, rapt, learning to read layers of irony, warning, affection, all without a single sound. Lies found no place here, for even the best intentioned deception faltered beneath the scrutiny of shared observation. Even at rest, faces never truly went blank. A relaxed jaw meant ease. Slightly parted lips suggested invitation or interest. Tight lines at the edge of the mouth betrayed tension, waiting to be acknowledged and soothed. In this world without voices, the face became the first promise of understanding, a living testament to the power of silent connection. In this silent world, hands became the truest voice of humanity. Evolution favoured dexterity, sculpting fingers long and graceful, joints supple and precise. Generations of silent conversation shaped the very bones and muscles, refining them into instruments of meaning. Each gesture became as distinct as a word, each motion deliberate and full of intent. Children learned this language as naturally as breathing. Small fingers fluttered uncertainly at first, mimicking the steady, patient movements of their parents. Over time, those hesitant shapes grew confident, flowing with clarity and emotion. A warning flicked sharply through the air, a gentle reassurance spiraled slow and open. The family's first lessons were not in words but in shared movement, woven into daily life without pause. Communities built entire lexicons of gesture. Regional dialects emerged, subtle variations in the curl of a hand or the angle of a wrist marking where someone came from. Travellers learned to watch carefully, picking up the local signs with respect and humility. There was no way to shout over someone here, no opportunity to dominate a conversation with sheer volume. Instead, every exchange required attention, patience, and the willingness to wait for meaning to be fully shaped and offered. Craft itself evolved around this need for expression. Tools were designed to be held and balanced with ease, leaving fingers free to sign even while working. Clothing allowed for full range of motion, sleeves tailored to stay clear of gesturing hands. Public spaces were arranged so lines of sight remained open, ensuring no meaning was lost in the crowd. Hands carried not just words but art. Dancers told entire epics with choreographed motion, fingers flickering like flames to represent battles, love stories, tragedies. Rituals involved shared gestures repeated in unison, binding communities together in silent understanding. There was beauty in this language, a kind of poetry that required no sound at all. And at the end of each day, families sat together in quiet rooms, sharing the story of their day with nothing but moving hands and knowing eyes. Meaning flowed between them effortlessly, a river of silent connection that needed no voice to be understood. In this world, hands were not merely tools. They were the voice itself, the oldest promise that humanity would always find a way to speak. From the moment they were born, humans in this world learned to speak with their hands. There was no period of babbling sounds or first spoken words. Instead, the earliest communication was visual and physical, the slow, careful shaping of meaning in air. Parents cradled infants and signed with them gently, coaxing understanding through mirrored movement and patient repetition. Toddlers responded with small, unsteady gestures, their chubby fingers mimicking the precise shapes they saw. Families celebrated these first signs as milestones as meaningful as first steps. Entire communities understood the value of this early fluency, weaving games and songs of movement to teach children the core symbols of their shared language. Learning to sign was as natural as breathing. No child was left behind, no voice left unheard, for there was no concept of speaking late. Instead, everyone learned to watch, to wait, to respond. Lessons happened everywhere, around cooking fires, in workshops, in open fields where elders taught with wide, sweeping signs visible from far away. Public education relied on this universal language. Teachers signed carefully, their expressions clear, ensuring every lesson was seen and absorbed. Students sat in wide circles, no one's view blocked, each child reading not only the signs but the shifting emotions of the teacher's face. There was no space for inattentive whispers or quiet rebellion in the back row. Everyone was part of the silent chorus of learning. Entire societies became fluent in shared silence. Trade agreements were negotiated in calm, deliberate exchanges of sign. Laws were argued through precise layered symbols, leaving little room for misinterpretation. Juries watched every flicker of a defendant's hands, every subtle shift of expression, weighing truth in the careful quiet. As generations passed, sign language grew richer and more layered. New signs emerged for new ideas. Old symbols combined to create poetry. Dialects and traditions formed, each region adding its own artistry while maintaining a core of mutual understanding. In this world, silence was never empty. It was full of shared meaning, given shape by patient, watching hands. In a world without spoken words, art became another language. Not simply decoration, but a living form of communication that carried nuance and depth. Walls were covered in careful symbols, shared designs that spoke of history, identity, and promise. Murals weren't just images, but public declarations, read and understood by all who passed. Children learned to read these painted stories alongside their sign language, tracing lines with curious fingers. They recognized the swirl that meant welcome, the jagged strokes of warning, the gentle curves of love. Entire cities bore the mark of their people's silent conversations in colour and form. Even the act of painting was communal, elders guiding the young, ensuring every symbol held meaning that would last through generations. Clothing became another medium for expression. Patterns woven into fabric spoke of family, profession, mood. A swirl of colour at the shoulder signalled grief. Muted tones meant contemplation. Bright contrasting bands called for celebration. In crowded markets, traders read these patterns as easily as they read the motion of hands, knowing at a glance who was ready to bargain and who wished to be left alone. Art was layered and deliberate. Nothing was rushed, for no voice could call attention in a moment. Instead, communication relied on patience, on lingering to take in detail. Sculptures held embedded symbols that told stories from every angle. Carvings marked doorways with personal crests or neighbourhood histories, each line chosen with care. Even the most private expressions took artistic form. Lovers painted symbols onto one another's skin in quiet moments, messages meant for only 2 sets of eyes. Parents left small carvings by sleeping mats for children to find in the morning, reminders of safety and belonging. In this world, art was not separate from language. It was language, a shared commitment to making meaning visible, enduring, and beautiful. And in the hush of night, when fires burned low and conversation stilled, people fell asleep surrounded by these symbols. The last thing they saw before dreams claimed them was a promise written in colour and shape. That even without voices, humanity would always find a way to speak. In a world without voices, distance posed a challenge for communication. No one could shout across a field or call to warn of danger. Instead, humans turned to rhythm. Drums and tapping became their calls, their alarms, their messengers in the quiet expanse. Villages built great communal drums from hollowed logs and stretched hides, each with a tone that carried far into the night. Patterns of beats replaced words, a code shared by all who listened. 3 slow strikes meant welcome. A rapid, uneven flurry signalled threat. Even children learned these rhythms early, drumming small messages in play that mirrored the serious calls of adults. Travellers carried portable instruments, sticks to strike stones, bones tapped against hollow gourds. Along well-worn paths they set up rhythm posts, waiting to hear returning signals before moving on. Campsites were arranged in loose circles, so drummers at the edges could warn of approaching visitors or animals with a practiced series of beats. Communication evolved beyond simple alerts. Poets and storytellers used rhythm to share tales, their hands moving in precise patterns against taut surfaces. Listeners sat in rapt attention, eyes closed, letting the rise and fall of sound conjure images in their minds. In festivals, entire communities joined in, a rolling chorus of drumming that shook the ground like thunder, binding them together in shared celebration. Even conflict had its rhythm. In tense negotiations between rival groups, a neutral drummer kept time, marking slow, deliberate beats to force calm pacing. Each side waited for their turn in silence, their arguments shaped in gesture, framed by the steady pulse that refused to hurry anger. The drum was both voice and mediator, ensuring no one drowned another out. As night fell, the world did not go silent. Instead, soft tapping filled the darkness, quiet as a heartbeat. Messages sent from one side of a village to the other, lovers exchanging goodnight calls in secret rhythms only they understood. In this world, sound was rare but precious, shaped and honed with as much care as any spoken word. And in the hush between beats, there was understanding. In this silent world, writing was not an invention born of spoken words. It was a necessity that emerged early, a tool to preserve meaning across space and time when no voice could carry it. From the first deliberate marks scratched into clay or carved into wood, humans understood that their thoughts could live beyond the moment, silent yet clear. Families taught children to read and write as soon as their hands were steady enough to hold a stylus. Symbols were simple at first: straight lines, circles, notches, each carrying shared meaning. Over generations, these marks became layered, intricate, able to record laws, histories, and dreams without a single sound uttered. In marketplaces, traders kept careful records of debts and promises on thin sheets of cured bark or pressed clay tablets. Deals were sealed not with words spoken aloud, but with signatures drawn in careful strokes. Disputes were settled by reading these records together, fingers tracing the shapes that remembered what no voice had said. Governments codified law in grand inscriptions on stone walls, visible to all who passed. There was no room for denying what had been agreed, no whispered changes, no misheard phrases. Justice relied on what could be seen and read, on the permanence of silent marks left behind. Storytelling found new life in written form. Elders transcribed old myths onto long rolls of woven fibre, decorated with symbols and art that explained every gesture in the grand silent epics of their people. Young readers sat in circles tracing lines with reverent fingers, learning their heritage without needing it to be spoken aloud. Even love letters existed in this world, carefully scribed messages exchanged between quiet hands, full of private symbols and shared metaphors. Carvings on hidden tree trunks, faint ink on smooth stones tucked into sleeping mats, promises written to endure long after their authors were gone. In a place without voices, writing was not merely useful, it was sacred, a promise that even in the deepest silence meaning would endure, unforgotten, waiting for eyes to find it once more. In this quiet world, touch became a language all its own. Without voices to call across distances, true understanding often required closeness. Hands laid gently on shoulders spoke comfort. A palm resting on another's back offered support. Fingers interlaced said what words never could. I am here with you. Children learned this language first from their parents' soothing caresses. Anxious tremors eased beneath slow, circular rubs. Small hands grasped large fingers, seeking reassurance in their steady warmth. The hush of these moments held more meaning than any lullaby ever could. Communities respected this need for tactile connection. Greetings were not shouted from afar, but exchanged in close, deliberate contact. Friends clasped forearms, pressing wrists together in recognition. Elders laid hands on the heads of the young, a silent blessing passed skin to skin. Even farewells lingered in long embraces, neither party rushing to let go. Among lovers, touch was poetry. Silent declarations traced across skin in slow, thoughtful patterns. Fingertips spelling private messages along collarbones, backs, stomachs. Whole conversations happened without a single sign, just the patient mapping of trust and promise across familiar terrain. In the glow of lantern light, these exchanges became their own quiet ceremony, sacred in their intimacy. Even conflict found a place for touch. Arguments that might have escalated with shouting were soothed when one hand covered another's trembling fingers. Tense negotiations paused when opponents sat close enough to feel the shared heat of anger fading into understanding. There was power in reaching out instead of recoiling, in choosing to bridge the gap with physical presence instead of words. At night, families slept pressed close, blankets shared without question. The warmth of another body was its own language, saying you're safe, you're not alone. In this world without voices, touch was not an afterthought. It was the most ancient promise of all, the unspoken vow to see, to feel, and to hold one another through anything. Cities in this world were shaped by the need to see, not hear. Streets were wide and open, laid out in careful grids and curves to maintain clear lines of sight. Buildings faced one another with generous windows, their facades designed to invite the eye rather than shut it out. Every corner was planned with the understanding that communication depended on visibility. Architects worked not just with stone and wood, but with light itself. Walkways angled to catch the sun so faces remained illuminated even at dawn and dusk. Overhanging awnings provided shade without casting deep, obscuring shadows. Lanterns were hung high and plentiful, casting gentle, diffuse glows that let gestures be seen clearly deep into the night. Public squares served as the beating hearts of these cities, open, expansive places where crowds gathered without fear of missing meaning in the press of bodies. Raised platforms allowed speakers, silent though they were, to sign to hundreds at once, their movements visible from every vantage. No one had to strain to hear, only to watch carefully and patiently. Homes were built with sightlines in mind. Neighbours could greet one another from windows or rooftops with easy signs, shared stories flowing across alleys and courtyards. Walls were designed to guide the eye rather than block it, encouraging connection even in dense, busy districts. Privacy existed but was chosen deliberately, marked by shutters closed in clear signal rather than shouted demands to be left alone. Markets pulsed with quiet life, stalls arranged in arcs and rows that let customers and sellers maintain constant visual dialogue. Bargaining happened in clear, decisive gestures, layered with subtle facial shifts that conveyed doubt, interest, final acceptance. No hawkers shouted over one another. Competition was in clarity, not volume. At night, cities did not fall silent because they had always been silent. Instead, they glowed with shared purpose, their open spaces alive with moving hands, expressive faces, and eyes that never lost track of one another. In these cities built for seeing, humanity learned that understanding was not given by voice, but earned by attention, a promise that even in a crowd, no one would go unseen. In this world without voices, conflict could not rely on raised tones or shouted threats. Anger had no volume to swell, no words to spit like weapons. Disagreements unfolded in silence, their heat held in the tightness of fists, the narrowing of eyes, the hard, deliberate movements of hands slicing the air. Arguments still existed. Humans remained passionate, stubborn, flawed, but they had learned to fight without sound, to pour their emotions into precise, undeniable signs. Insults became crisp, cutting gestures delivered with devastating clarity. Accusations required steady eye contact, forcing each party to confront the truth of what they said without the safety of turning away or yelling over another's words. Communities developed rituals to keep conflicts from boiling over. Mediators sat with disputing sides, watching their hands carefully, slowing the pace with calm, deliberate signals of their own. A raised palm could halt a heated exchange. A slow, repeated gesture urged patience and reconsideration. In marketplaces, disagreements paused until both sides agreed on clear, mutually understood signs, eliminating the risk of misinterpretation. There were no sudden, explosive fights caused by misunderstood tones or words spoken in haste. Instead, emotions simmered visibly, giving everyone around time to see and react. Friends intervened with a gentle hand on a shoulder, diffusing tension before it ignited. Neighbours watched over disputes, knowing that being seen was its own form of accountability. In matters of justice, trials unfolded with solemn grace. Accusers and defenders signed their cases before attentive juries, who watched every movement for honesty or deceit. There was no way to lie with tone alone, no way to weep theatrically to sway hearts. The face and hands had to agree in truth. Sentences were delivered not with harsh proclamations, but with slow, weighty signs, carrying the shared responsibility of a community that had listened carefully to every silent word. At night, after the anger had ebbed, reconciliation was also silent. Apologies came in softened eyes, in tentative gestures offered slowly, asking for forgiveness without a single sound. And forgiveness was granted in an embrace, a resting of hands together, a quiet promise that even in a world without voices, understanding could be found. In this quiet world, meals were not chaotic affairs filled with chatter and clanging voices. Instead, they unfolded in a hush that felt deliberate, sacred. Families gathered around low tables or woven mats, arranging themselves so every face remained visible in the soft, flickering light of lanterns or hearth fires. The preparation itself was a shared language. Hands moved in coordinated gestures, passing ingredients without spoken requests. A glance and a nod replaced words of thanks. Recipes were remembered through motion. How many turns of the wrist to grind spices, how wide a sweep to scatter grain over hot stones. Apprentices watched carefully, learning these culinary dances without needing a single instruction spoken aloud. When it came time to eat, the atmosphere held a focused stillness. Conversations happened in precise, patient signs, eyes meeting across the table to ensure nothing was missed. Children learned early to wait their turn, to watch until the path was clear for their hands to move. No one spoke over another, no voice rose to drown out meaning. Each idea was given space to unfold in silence. Disagreements at the table could not become shouting matches. A parent's frown was enough to pause a quarrel. A steady, flat palm laid on the table signalled a demand for calm. Instead of escalating, tempers cooled in the shared hush, leaving room for understanding to grow. Meals were more than sustenance, they were connection. The slow sharing of dishes across the table was a promise of trust. The deliberate passing of bread, the careful ladling of stew, these small acts wove a quiet intimacy that words might have spoiled. Laughter existed here too, but it shone in eyes, in the quick flicker of playful signs, in the tilt of heads pressed close together to whisper with fingers alone. When the meal ended, the table was cleaned in a practiced cooperative silence. Hands dried bowls, folded cloth swept crumbs away. No instructions barked, no arguments about duty. Just shared purpose, shared responsibility, shared quiet. And as the lamps were dimmed and families retired to sleep, they carried with them the memory of that calm communion, a nightly reminder that in silence they were never alone. Despite their quiet lives, humans in this world knew how to celebrate. Festivals were not loud with cheering or song, but alive with light and rhythm that spoke just as powerfully. As dusk fell, entire villages transformed, lanterns strung from tree to tree, their glow reflected in pools and polished stones. Pathways were lit with carefully arranged fires, guiding crowds into open plazas where space was left clear for movement and meaning. Communities prepared for weeks, crafting decorations that shimmered and caught the eye. Painted banners marked homes, their symbols layered with greetings, blessings, and shared memories. Children practiced the signs for festival stories, their hands fluttering with excitement even in rehearsals. Artisans carved new drums, stretching fresh hides so the beats would carry true and clear into the waiting dark. When the night of the festival arrived, silence did not mean stillness. People gathered shoulder to shoulder, watching with rapt attention as dancers stepped into the firelight. Each movement was storytelling, every flick of a wrist or slow arc of an arm adding to a silent epic known by all. Faces were painted in luminous dyes that glowed in the shifting light, making expressions even clearer, more dramatic. Drummers surrounded the plaza, their rhythms carefully chosen, slow at first to draw everyone in, then quickening as the story demanded urgency. Beats replaced chants, the rise and fall of sound guiding the crowd through shared emotion. Entire villages tapped along with hands on knees, feet on earth, a joined pulse that echoed heartbeats in the hush. Market stayed open late, stalls illuminated with gentle, warm light so hands could still be read. Transactions happened with practiced, graceful signs, the slow pace unhurried even as crowds pressed close. Food was shared freely, Baskets passed hand to hand without needing to call out for attention. In that glow, everyone watched one another, understanding without question. And when the final drumbeat faded, the lanterns were lowered one by one. Families walked home beneath a sky full of stars, their paths lit by memory and the afterimage of moving hands. Even then, gestures continued in the dark, fingers tracing words slowly against loved ones' palms, a promise that the light and rhythm of their silent world would never truly end. Daily work in this silent world was a choreography of understanding. Fields were planted in quiet collaboration, farmers exchanging instructions in broad, visible signs that swept through rows of green. No shouting over wind or distance, just patient, clear gestures that guided the planting and harvesting of food. Workers paused often to meet each other's eyes, ensuring nothing was missed, that each plan was shared fully before hands returned to the soil. In workshops, artisans communicated with precise, economical motion. Carpenters tapped chisels twice to indicate readiness, then signed the next steps with fingers dusted in sawdust. Weavers moved in pairs, synchronizing patterns with subtle nods and shared signals, creating intricate designs without breaking the hush. Apprentices learned not by listening to lectures, but by watching every practiced move, imitating until their own hands carried the knowledge forward. Markets were hubs of quiet commerce. Stalls were arranged in gentle curves so everyone could see and sign freely. Sellers displayed goods with labels marked in shared symbols, prices negotiated through practiced movements that carried no anger, only patient haggling. A buyer might lift a basket slightly to signal interest, and the seller would respond with a small tilt of the head and a slow, deliberate offer. Transactions were honest, transparent, built on the promise that nothing could be misheard or misunderstood when everyone watched so carefully. Long-distance trade used travelling caravans marked by flags and painted symbols that identified their home villages and intentions. When they arrived at new settlements, they displayed goods and greetings in grand, sweeping signs designed to be understood across cultural dialects. Disputes were rare, resolved by neutral mediators who translated gestures and ensured fairness without the threat of shouted accusations. Even heavy labour maintained this quiet grace. Builders raised walls together with nods and signs, pausing to confirm every measurement with fingers spread wide, avoiding mistakes that might come from rushed speech. Porters signalled readiness with a touch to the shoulder, and teams lifted in unison, muscles straining but breath steady, their silence a testament to shared purpose. Work here was not frantic or fragmented. It was unified, careful, and deeply human. In this world without voices, trade and labour were acts of cooperation, a constant promise that even in the busiest moments, people would always take the time to see one another, to understand before they acted, and to ensure that nothing essential was ever lost in the noise that never came. Buildings in this world were not designed to muffle voices or hold sound, but to preserve sight lines and invite understanding. Architects became artists of openness, crafting walls and roofs that framed conversations in light and shadow. Homes were set around broad courtyards so families could see each other from every doorway, sharing news and affection in the motion of hands even across distance. Public spaces were equally deliberate. Government halls were circular, ensuring no one sat behind another or hid from view. Every seat had a clear line to the speaker's raised platform, where complex signs and subtle facial shifts could be read by all. Even the most heated debates had to be faced directly. Arguments given form in deliberate gestures no one could pretend to miss. Markets sprawled like open fans, stalls arranged to keep the lines of sight uninterrupted. Pathways curved gently, avoiding blind corners where meaning might be lost. Overhead canopies filtered light to keep faces softly visible even in the brightest midday sun. Lanterns were hung in patterned clusters that spread illumination evenly, letting hands speak clearly long after dusk settled over rooftops. Windows were not just for light, but for communication itself. Neighbours signed greetings from their sills, checking in on the day's work or sharing quiet jokes without crossing the street. Upper floors included small balconies designed for restful conversation, with privacy achieved not by thick walls but by careful spacing that respected personal boundaries while leaving room for connection. Decoration was chosen with the same thoughtful purpose. Murals told shared histories in symbols everyone understood, while patterned tiles marked important meeting spots, guiding visitors like a silent map. Even colour carried meaning. Doorways painted with welcoming hues, shutters with quiet, muted tones to signal the wish for solitude. In this world, architecture was more than shelter. It was language given shape in wood, stone, and light. Every arch and window, every courtyard and plaza carried the promise that no one would be hidden, that communication would remain clear, and that the bonds of a silent people would be built on seeing one another fully and without interruption. In a world without voices, light and colour became essential tools of communication. Lanterns were not simply sources of illumination, but instruments of meaning, their glow crafted to carry subtle messages through the hush. Villages developed shared codes of colour. Soft blue signalled safety and welcome. Warm amber meant caution. Deep red warned of danger or boundaries not to be crossed. As night fell, pathways lit up with carefully placed lanterns that shifted hue in response to communal needs. When travellers arrived, the lights turned inviting shades, encouraging approach. During times of tension or negotiation, colours cooled to calming tones, urging patience and consideration. Entire communities agreed on these silent signals, ensuring no one misunderstood the mood of the place they entered. Inside homes, light was more intimate. Families used small tinted lamps to share private messages without words. A parent might leave a pale green glow in a child's room to soothe fears at bedtime, a sign of safety and peace. Couples lit soft, rose-coloured candles to invite closeness and trust. Even apologies were offered in the form of a single lantern, its gentle light placed outside a door as an unspoken plea for forgiveness. Colour itself carried meaning in daily life. Walls and doorways were painted deliberately. Bright, patterned thresholds invited visitors, while darker, subdued tones asked for quiet or solitude. Clothing was dyed with symbols and palettes that spoke of mood, family, or profession. A merchant might wear contrasting bands of colour to catch the eye and signal readiness to bargain, while a mourner wore layered greys that told the community to tread gently around their grief. Artisans became masters of this language. They blended pigments to tell stories without a single gesture, layering shades to evoke memory, caution, hope. Public murals changed over time, repainted to reflect new seasons, new moods, shared joys or shared sorrows. Even children learned to read these colours instinctively, understanding from the start that what was unsaid could still be perfectly clear. In this world without voices, light and colour were the words that travelled farthest, that filled the darkness with shared meaning. They were proof that silence need not be empty, but could be alive with intention and beauty, carrying the promise that humanity would always find new ways to be understood. In a world without voices, even clothing became a language. Textiles were not merely protection against cold or ornament for vanity, but living canvases that carried messages for all to see. Every thread, every dye, every pattern was chosen with care, designed to say what lips could not. Children grew up surrounded by this quiet vocabulary. Their first garments were simple, dyed in soft, welcoming colours that told neighbours they were new to the world, in need of patience and care. As they grew older, Patterns changed to mark coming of age, achievements, or family lineage. Elder relatives taught them how to read these woven stories, ensuring that meaning was never lost across generations. In crowded marketplaces, merchants wore bright, contrasting stripes that caught the eye and invited trade. Buyers signalled seriousness or indecision through subtle changes in what they draped across their shoulders, a slow, deliberate unfolding of cloth that said everything without a single gesture. Transactions were more than the exchange of goods. They were negotiations of colour and texture, both parties reading the unspoken terms in fabric. Formal events and ceremonies demanded even greater precision. Weddings were marked by elaborate robes stitched with shared symbols of promise and unity, each family's history woven together in intricate patterns. Funerals wrapped mourners in muted, sombre tones, signalling their grief so that the entire community might approach with gentle understanding. No one had to ask if someone was mourning. They could see it at a glance and respond with silent respect. Artisans became keepers of this language, their looms as important as any library. They experimented with dyes made from crushed berries, bark and minerals to expand the palette of expression. New designs spread slowly from village to village, evolving as they went, absorbing local traditions and needs until entire regions had their own dialects of colour and weave. Even in private moments, textiles held meaning. Lovers exchanged bands of cloth with secret patterns known only to them, a private promise hidden in the folds of daily dress. Parents wrapped children in blankets that told family stories through images and colours, surrounding them with safety not just of warmth, but of memory. In this silent world, cloth was more than utility. It was conversation, heritage, and love all woven together, proving that words were never the only way to speak. In a world without voices, sound was not constant but precious. And so, drumming rose beyond mere signal or warning. It became art, poetry shaped in rhythm and silence alike. Communities gathered around large, hollow drums carved from ancient trees, their surfaces stretched with taut, polished hides that held the memory of every beat ever struck. Children learned to listen before they learned to drum. They sat in circles watching elders' hands rise and fall, understanding that silence between strikes carried as much meaning as the sound itself. A single slow beat could soothe anger, call for calm. A rapid flutter of strikes could tell of joy or urgent need. Patterns were memorized, traded like stories, evolving over time until villages shared entire conversations in rhythm. Festivals transformed when the drummers took their places. Fires burned low so light fell softly over moving arms, shadows dancing in time with the music. Dancers followed the cadence, their steps punctuated by the drum's steady pulse, gestures becoming bolder or softer with each shift in tempo. Spectators tapped along on knees, walls, the earth beneath them, their shared rhythm weaving the crowd into one living organism, breathing and moving as one. Storytellers used drumming to conjure entire worlds. A slow, low roll evoked the approach of a distant storm. Sharp, staccato beats became footsteps in a tense chase. Silence fell like a cliff, the pause heavy with possibility before the drum returned with a new tale. There was no need for words. The audience filled in the details, each listener interpreting the rhythm through the lens of their own memories and fears. Even private moments were marked by quiet drumming. Lovers shared gentle, syncopated taps on hollow bowls or tabletops, messages only they could understand. Parents taught children to calm themselves with steady beats on their own chests, finding comfort in the rhythm of their own hearts. Communities relied on this art in times of mourning too, gathering to share grief in slow, mournful patterns that rose and fell like sobs no voice could utter. In this world without speech, drumming was the music of humanity's shared feeling. It offered expression that needed no translation, no words at all. It was the promise that even in silence, there would always be a way to say what must be said, to hear what must be heard, and to remember that sound, when chosen carefully, could mean everything. In this world without voices, storytelling flourished in forms that needed no sound. Evening gatherings saw communities gather before walls or stretched cloth screens, the glow of lanterns casting shapes and colour in gentle light. Shadows danced in carefully rehearsed patterns, performers' hands and bodies creating whole sagas without uttering a single word. Children sat cross-legged in front rows, eyes wide, reading the sweep of arms that became rivers, the fluttering fingers that turned into wind through grass. Elders nodded in approval at subtle expressions that conveyed betrayal, love, loss, triumph. Stories passed down for generations were retold in new shapes, ensuring memory was never stagnant but always alive, always being rediscovered. Technology evolved to meet this need. Artists painted panels with layered symbols that revealed new details in shifting light. Screens were designed to catch and scatter colours deliberately, so that a single lantern could bring a flat scene to life with movement and depth. Carved wheels rotated to produce animated patterns of running animals, flowing water, dancing figures, all moving in mesmerising silence. Storytelling troupes travelled between villages, carrying collapsible stages and painted screens rolled carefully for the journey. They arrived as honoured guests, setting up in public squares where the entire settlement could see. Payment wasn't just in food or coin, but in new stories traded, fresh symbols taught and learned, weaving cultures together through shared silent language. Even private storytelling thrived. Families gathered around small hearths, parents signing old legends with slow, careful movements, so children could memorize every shift of hand and flicker of expression. Lovers invented entire narratives and shared signs only they understood, a secret theatre of glances and touch that needed no audience. Histories were preserved this way too, not shouted proclamations or written decrees alone, but living performances where memory stayed embodied. A community could not forget its past when it was performed before them, witnessed with attentive eyes, carried away in the shapes of gestures that would be repeated again and again, even after elders were gone. In this world, cinema and storytelling were not distractions but bonds. They held people together in quiet nights, reminding everyone that while they had no voice, they would always have stories, and the promise that nothing important would go unseen or unremembered. In this quiet world, parenting unfolded in gentle silence. Without words to soothe or instruct, parents relied on patient touch, steady eyes, and the careful choreography of hands to teach and comfort their children. Infants were cradled close, feeling the steady rise and fall of a caregiver's breath, learning trust in the calm rhythm of a heartbeat pressed against their ear. Mothers and fathers signed to their babies before the little ones could even mimic the shapes. Slow, deliberate movements that promised safety, affection, boundaries. Even before understanding dawned, children watched, absorbing the language in the same way they learned to crawl or walk. They learned that a lifted brow signaled curiosity, that a slow sweep of the hand could soothe fear. As children grew, discipline was delivered not with harsh words but with controlled expressions and unyielding stillness. A firm stare replaced shouted reprimands. A hand held up in a frozen sign demanded that impulsive movements stop. There was no threat of sudden yelling. Correction came with time, focus, a promise that every lesson would be fully given and fully received. Learning itself was an act of shared quiet. Parents sat with children, signing stories of ancestors, demonstrating skills with deliberate, repeatable gestures. Children practiced over and over, copying the movements until they became second nature. The absence of noise meant fewer distractions. The mind was free to watch carefully, to understand deeply before acting. Nights held special rituals of connection. Parents tucked their children in with blankets that carried the family's colours and patterns, tracing slow signs in the air above them, promises of love and protection. Sometimes they simply sat together in silence, exchanging the soft language of eyes and touch, making clear that no matter how quiet the world was, they were not alone. Community supported this form of parenting. Neighbours watched over playing children, responding to squabbles with firm signs and calm separation. Elders taught not by scolding, but by modelling the patience and focus expected of all. It was a collective vow that every child would be seen, taught, guided without harshness or fear. In this world without voices, parenting was not the absence of words, but the presence of unwavering attention. It was the promise that nothing essential would go unsaid simply because it could not be heard. That love, correction, and memory could be given fully with hands, with eyes, with the quiet promise to always understand. In this silent world, courtship was a dance of patience and subtlety. Without whispered flirtations or bold declarations shouted across a room, love blossomed through the careful study of movement, the quiet invitation of eyes meeting eyes and holding steady. Every gesture mattered, every shift of expression carried weight. Young people learned to read these unspoken signals from watching elders. They saw how a gentle brush of fingers against a sleeve could mean interest, how a slow, lingering sign offered a question that needed answering in kind. There was no room for casual promises or impulsive words. Intent had to be shown clearly, honestly, with hands that trembled only when the truth was too large to hide. Meeting places were arranged with open sight lines, designed to let potential partners observe one another without pretending not to watch. Courtyards filled with slow-moving crowds offered space for small, testing gestures. A tilt of the head, a raised brow, a hand opened in invitation. The response might be immediate or come days later, after careful thought and private consideration. When affection grew, couples developed their own shared signs, private dialects of fingers and eyes that only they understood. A secret touch on the wrist that meant I missed you. A small looping movement traced against a partner's palm that whispered stay. Lovers sat for hours in quiet corners, exchanging these hidden conversations, building a bond that required no sound to be real. Public ceremonies of commitment were equally silent but deeply moving. Families gathered in circles to watch the slow, deliberate exchange of signs that promised loyalty and partnership. Patterns woven into garments declared the union to the entire community, symbols of shared intent visible to all. There were no vows spoken aloud, no grand pronouncements, but no one questioned the sincerity of what was promised, seen so plainly in careful, honest movement. Even conflict within relationships was navigated through this language. Disagreements cooled in the space it took to form clear signs, in the requirement to see and acknowledge the other's meaning. Apologies were offered with trembling hands and sorrowful eyes, received with slow, forgiving gestures that closed the gap between them. In a world without voices, courtship was not less expressive but more deliberate. It was a promise that love would be given with full attention, that it would be built on seeing each other completely, and that silence would never be emptiness so long as two people chose to fill it with meaning. Friendship in this silent world was built not on loud laughter or shouted greetings across busy streets, but on the slow, intentional sharing of space and meaning. Companions learned one another's gestures as well as their own, creating entire dialogues that could be spoken with the flick of a wrist, the arch of a brow, the soft drape of an arm over a shoulder. Young friends played games of sign and movement, challenging one another to invent new symbols on the spot, giggling in breathless silence when someone struggled to keep up. These early exchanges forged bonds rooted in watching closely, responding generously, and learning to wait for another's meaning to fully form before answering. Groups gathered in public squares and open courtyards, arranging themselves in loose circles so every face remained visible. Conversation flowed in a quiet current, each person waiting their turn to sign while the others watched with focused respect. Jokes were delivered with sly twists of the hand, the humour often living in the shared pause that followed, the collective understanding that spread in small smiles and shaking shoulders. Friendship required memory, remembering the subtle differences in each person's signing style, the personal idioms that grew between them like private jokes. A quick tap on the knee to signal agreement, a gentle tug at a sleeve to call for attention, a small circle traced in the air that meant let's go, shared only between the closest of friends. Disagreements happened, of course, but the silence forced them to slow down. Heated gestures paused when a friend laid a steadying hand on an arm. The need to see each other clearly prevented the careless insults that might have slipped out in spoken words. Reconciliation was just as deliberate. An apology signed with tremulous fingers, accepted with a nod and an embrace that required no explanation. Long journeys were made lighter by these quiet connections. Travellers shared simple signs to plan the day, pointed to the horizon, and back to one another in a promise of shared purpose. Even in exhaustion, there was comfort in knowing that a friend's steady eyes would always meet yours. That meaning would never be lost in the noise that never existed. In this world without voices, friendship was a pact to see and be seen, to pay attention not just when it was easy, but especially when it was hard. It was the vow that even in silence, no one would ever have to speak alone. In this world without voices, grief did not erupt in wails or anguished cries. It unfolded in quiet, visible ways that left nothing hidden. Mourners wore sombre colours and simple patterns that told the entire community of their loss without a single word spoken. No one had to ask. They could see the sorrow as clearly as if it had been shouted from rooftops. Funerals were gatherings of patient presence. Circles of family and neighbours sat around small fires or in open courtyards, the flicker of light catching tears that were not hidden or wiped away too quickly. Elders signed prayers in slow, deliberate motions, hands trembling as they shaped each blessing, each farewell. The hush was not oppressive but respectful, a collective promise to watch, to witness, to hold space for the pain that had no sound. Comfort was given with touch and eyes. A hand placed gently on a shoulder stayed there without rush, fingers curling in quiet solidarity. Embraces lingered, no one pulling away until both had shared the warmth fully. Eyes met and held, allowing the grieving to see understanding reflected back at them, reminding them that while words could not fill the emptiness, connection could soften it. Community supported the bereaved in simple, clear gestures. Neighbours brought baskets of food marked with symbols of compassion, set them quietly at the door without expecting thanks. Tasks were completed in silence. Fields tended, children watched, repairs made. Each act a sign of shared burden, an unspoken agreement that no one should carry grief alone. Stories of the departed were told in the movement of hands, faces lit by memory. Family members recounted deeds and lessons, signing them slowly so even the smallest children could see and remember. Laughter was allowed here too, silent but real, eyes crinkling in fondness at remembered joy. The dead were not forgotten in hushed reverence, but kept alive in the continuing language of those left behind. At night, households dimmed their lanterns to softer shades, the glow a promise of rest and reflection. The grieving lay wrapped in blankets marked with quiet symbols of mourning, knowing the world would see them, would understand without demanding they explain. In the hush, they could begin to heal, held not by words but by the patient, unwavering gaze of those who would never look away. Though humanity shared the gift of silent language, no two regions signed exactly the same. Over generations, communities developed their own dialects of the hand, shaped by local needs, traditions, and histories. A single gesture might mean welcome in one village, but ask for patience in another, its meaning carried in subtle changes of speed, angle, or accompanying expression. Travellers learned early to watch closely when they entered new lands. Markets greeted them with curious eyes, the first exchanges slow and careful as both sides adjusted, clarifying signs with gentle corrections and shared smiles. Misunderstandings were common but rarely disastrous. They were met with patient repetition, teaching in the act of trade itself. Children grew up bilingual in gesture when their families moved between regions. They learned to shift easily from one set of signs to another, adapting the twist of the wrist or tilt of the head to match the dialect of new friends. Communities valued these bridges, treating such children as natural interpreters, respected for their ability to connect places that otherwise risked drifting apart. Festivals became times of shared learning. Troops of performers travelled from town to town, demonstrating stories in a blend of regional signs that everyone could follow with a bit of care. Visitors picked up new gestures during these events, carrying them home like treasured gifts, weaving them into local speech until the boundaries between dialects softened at the edges. Governments and councils worked to preserve this diversity without losing unity. Official decrees were inscribed in standardized symbols, the core language that every region taught its children alongside their own variations. Judges and mediators trained to read multiple dialects fluently, ensuring fairness in negotiations and disputes. Even private relationships crossed these differences. Marriages between people of different villages created entirely new family signs, intimate languages that combined the best of both traditions. Friends and lovers delighted in teaching one another the subtleties of their home dialects, savouring the feeling of learning and being learned in return. In this world without voices, humanity accepted that silence did not mean sameness, that a shared language could hold multitudes of meaning without ever drowning any of them out, and that by watching carefully, by giving one another the time to show what they meant, they would always find a way to understand. Not every place in this silent world was blessed with endless light. Some communities lived among thick forests where shadows pooled even at midday, others in caves where sun rarely reached, and many in the long northern nights where winter stretched darkness over the land for months at a time. Here, hands learned a new language, not of sight but of touch. Children were taught early to read meaning in the shape of another's fingers pressing gently into their own. Simple greetings traced in palm lines, questions asked with a tap or squeeze, answers given with a slow rub across the back of a hand. It was patient work, requiring stillness and trust, the knowledge that closeness was necessary to understand. In homes built deep within stone or shaded by ancient trees, families gathered close to converse. They sat in tight circles, knees brushing, hands resting lightly on arms or laps, moving only when they meant to speak. Silence in these spaces was not emptiness but an invitation, allowing each participant to shape their words in the careful press of skin against skin. Communities developed entire tactile dialects. A series of short taps might direct someone to wait. A long press could offer comfort or apology. Disagreements unfolded with hands clasping and releasing, fingers curling to show frustration before flattening in signs of peace. Mediators sat between disputing parties, helping interpret the subtleties that could not be seen, ensuring nothing was lost in the dark. Travellers passing through these lands learned to adjust their habits. They practiced moving more slowly, warning before reaching out so as not to startle. They learned to speak with hands resting gently against strangers' palms, discovering that meaning could be shared without eyes ever meeting. Trust was built in the warmth of contact, the understanding that all must agree to listen and to be listened to in turn. Even love took on new forms in these places. Couples spoke entire sentences along the curve of a partner's spine, signed declarations of loyalty against the pulse at a lover's wrist. In the hush of shared beds, fingers traced old promises and new dreams, ensuring that nothing essential was ever lost to the dark. In this world without voices, tactile language was proof that silence could be full, that when the eye failed, the hand would not, that even in the deepest night, people would always find a way to understand one another. In some regions, language extended beyond gesture and touch into the very landscape itself. Cultures developed rich traditions of pattern and carving, turning their environments into permanent visible records of meaning. Cliffs were etched with sprawling symbols that told of history and lore, while doorposts bore delicate lines marking family ancestry and personal vows. Children learned to read these carvings as naturally as others learned hand signs. They traced grooves with small fingers, listening as elders explained the stories each line contained. A spiral might mean the turning of seasons. A jagged mark could warn of danger or boundaries not to be crossed. These symbols did not fade with memory, but remained to guide generations, silent but enduring. In places where wood was abundant, entire buildings became libraries of meaning. Beams were carved with blessings for protection and prosperity. Door lintels bore prayers of welcome. Furniture was covered in intricate patterns that carried private promises between loved ones, visible only to those who knew how to read them. Even everyday tools might carry small, careful notches that reminded their owners of lessons learned or tasks yet to be completed. Stoneworkers became honoured members of their communities, their skill not just in shaping rock but in choosing the right symbols to preserve. They worked slowly, each strike of chisel a commitment to clarity. Errors could not be smoothed away easily, so every mark was made with purpose, with the promise that what was carved would last long after the carver was gone. Trade routes spread these patterns far beyond their places of origin. Travellers learned to interpret foreign symbols carefully, asking local guides to explain meanings that might differ from their own traditions. Disputes were sometimes avoided entirely when merchants paused to study a carved warning along a mountain pass, or read the history of alliances etched onto the walls of a trading post. In private spaces, carving and pattern became acts of love. Couples exchanged small tokens of wood or bone, etched with personal symbols that only they understood. Parents carved names and blessings into cradles, ensuring that even before a child could understand gesture, they were surrounded by the promise of belonging. In this world without voices, pattern and carving were more than art. They were conversation made solid, history given shape, a testament that meaning did not need sound to last, that humanity would always find ways to remember, to share, and to be understood, even in the silence of stone. Silence in this world was never emptiness. It was the shared agreement to see one another fully, to wait patiently for meaning to take shape without interruption. It was not an absence but a promise, a vow that every thought, every feeling would be given the space it needed to be understood. Communities learned to embrace this quiet as a gift. Streets held the hush of attentive movement, people walking with deliberate calm so they could greet one another with open hands and meeting eyes. Markets buzzed with the silent rhythm of barter and trade, signs flashing in graceful arcs, negotiations carried out in the slow poetry of fingers and gaze. Families found comfort in this silence. Around evening fires they sat in circles telling stories with hands that cast shadows onto walls, faces that shifted with every emotion. Children watched in rapt attention, their own small hands imitating the gestures that held generations of memory. Even the youngest knew that silence was not to be feared. It was to be filled with meaning, with connection, with the promise that no one would be ignored. Artists and builders carved this quiet into their work. Homes opened onto courtyards designed for clear sight lines, walls painted in symbols that spoke of heritage and hope. Drummers practiced rhythms that carried feeling without a single word, their beats rising and falling like breath shared across the waiting dark. Light and colour became languages in their own right, painting conversations onto doorways, clothing, and the very streets people walked. Even conflict found a different shape here. Arguments slowed in the silence, demanding thought before accusation. Apologies were signed with trembling fingers, forgiveness given with a slow, deliberate touch. Anger had to be seen, acknowledged, soothed. It could not hide behind volume or speed. And in grief, silence held space for healing. Communities surrounded the mourning with presence rather than noise, offering steady hands and eyes that did not look away. Comfort was given without demand, understanding offered without interruption. Silence in this world was not empty. It was full of promise, of patience, of possibility. It was the knowledge that humanity did not need sound to be human, that connection was possible through nothing more than the shared willingness to see and be seen, to wait and be waited for, to hold one another without letting go. Across this silent world, humanity remained deeply connected. Distance did not silence communication. It shaped it into something richer, something that demanded intention and respect. Villages separated by mountains developed their own dialects of sign and pattern. Yet when traders arrived, they took the time to learn, to watch, to understand. Travellers moved slowly by necessity, their journeys marked by pauses at way stations where lanterns glowed in welcoming colours. At each stop they shared the news of far-off places, not in shouted proclamations, but in carefully crafted symbols and rhythmic beats on shared drums. The exchange was deliberate, built on mutual effort, leaving little room for misunderstanding. Festivals became threads that tied regions together. Communities gathered to share dances of gesture. Storytelling performed in universal signs that transcended local differences. Drummers blended regional rhythms into new compositions that all could follow. Food was traded without words. Recipes shared in quiet demonstrations that spread flavours and traditions far beyond their points of origin. Conflict between regions did not vanish, but it transformed. Armies could not rally behind fiery speeches or whip crowds into frenzy with slogans hurled into the wind. Leaders met in neutral spaces designed for clear sight lines. Their negotiations slowed by the very silence that demanded they pay attention. Mediators trained in many dialects ensured no subtlety was lost, no grievance overlooked. Peace, when it came, was not forged in roaring triumph, but in the slow, quiet promise of understanding. Art and technology carried this connectedness further. Carvings and patterns marked safe paths across wilderness, messages left in stone to guide and warn future travellers. Lantern codes signalled shared needs across trade routes, a single colour calling for help, another offering welcome. Written symbols, standardised enough to be read by all, recorded alliances, laws, and the histories that no voice would ever tell but no mind would ever forget. And in the dark of night, people everywhere felt the same hush. A quiet broken only by the soft beat of drums, the flicker of a hand signing a promise across a glowing courtyard, the gentle touch of comfort shared between loved ones. In that hush, humanity remembered that silence was not the absence of connection, but its most honest form. A world without voices was not a world without communication. It was a world where understanding was built slowly, deliberately, and with care. A world where to speak was to show yourself completely, and to listen was to see someone truly. Night settles over this quiet world, wrapping fields, villages and cities in a hush that feels deep and knowing. Lanterns burn low, casting soft pools of light that let gestures linger in the dark. Families gather close, signing their last words of the day in slow, careful shapes, before resting their hands against one another in silent goodnight. Streets empty, but they do not feel abandoned. Shapes pass one another with a nod, a raised hand, a flicker of fingers that wishes safe rest. The rhythm of drumming slows, heartbeat steady, marking time for dancers who sway in gentle arcs, telling stories meant to soothe rather than stir. Patterns of light shift on walls and floors, speaking in colour of safety and peace. In small rooms, parents trace signs above children drifting into sleep, promising protection through the long, dark hours. Partners sit side by side, exchanging quiet touches, fingers spelling out secrets and shared dreams too precious to be spoken aloud. Even those who sleep alone wrap themselves in blankets marked with symbols of belonging, reminders that someone, somewhere, understands. Elders close their eyes, remembering days of carving and weaving, teaching and comforting, their hands still knowing the shapes of every promise ever made. Their final thoughts are not of words left unsaid, but of gestures given and received. A life built in honest motion and seeing eyes. Above all of it, the world rests, a planet that learned to speak without sound, to carry love and grief and hope without ever raising its voice. It breathes slowly, exhaling warmth into the night. Stars look down, their cold light mirrored in the watchful eyes of those who refuse to turn away, even now. And as sleep takes hold, silence is not emptiness, but fullness. It is the place where meaning lives patiently, waiting to be found. It is the space where connection remains unbroken, no matter the distance. It is the promise that even without voices, no one is alone.